I went on Robert Helms's show on Radio London to try and dig this up a few hours ago, and he said to me, well, where does the Doughnut begin? Where does outer London begin? You know, and of course I had to say it began at my childhood home in the sort of hinterland between the Hampstead Garden suburb and East Finchley. But Hanif, you are more authentically Doughnut in Bromley. And I wondered I thought, you know, it'd be nice to talk about the kind of sensibility of outer London, if we can define such a thing. Who comes out of outer London? What does it mean? How is it different? And how does our sense of being outer Londoners or Doughnutians differ from anybody else's? I mean, what was your first memory of Bromley as a child, Hanif?
I wrote these lines a few weeks ago. I was writing something about a writer called E.R. Braithwaite, who I've recently adapted to So With Love for the BBC. And I remember, and I wrote these lines, I didn't know I was coloured until I went to school. So my experience of the suburbs was really my father coming from India, marrying a white woman, and being a mixed race kid in an almost entirely white, homogenous, post-war, bombed out wasteland, really. And really for me, and my hatred of the suburbs was really to do with race and to do with trying to work out why everybody asked me throughout my childhood where I came from, and thinking that people in the suburbs were existentialists. They would say to you all the time, where do you come from? And I would say, well, I come from that house over there, and there's my mum in her slippers. And they would say, yeah, but where do you really come from? And then I would say, well, I really come from that house over there, and there's my mum in her slippers. And this would go on, and I began to think that I was going mad. So I spent most of my childhood trying to work out who I was in relation to what other people said about me. They'd say things like, is it too cold here for you? And things like that. And then when I went to school, and in those days, I don't know if it was like that for you, but the schools were really Dickensian. I mean, they were violent and rough, the teachers hit you. I remember the first day of being at secondary school, and the teacher put 2 sticks on his desk, and he said, this is Big Willie and this is Little Willie, he said. And, you know, you'll be seeing a lot of these. And so...
It was an innocent era.
It was So for me, it was really a horror to grow up there at that time. But I have to say, I learned a lot about race and about racism.
Well, I mean, Bromley is tradition, you know, there's a good tradition in outer London, southeast London, suburbia of neo-fascism, isn't there? I mean,
yeah.
It runs deep. The Stephen Lawrence killing was down the road from here.
In Eltham, yeah.
In Eltham.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you're not exaggerating, are you?
Well, you go to people's houses and they'd say, you can't come in, we're with the NF. You know, and these were, you know, you'd go around to your mates. And I remember having a girlfriend and everybody would go around to her house. And I kept thinking, well, why won't they invite me around? Why can't I go around there? And the dad said, well, you can't come in here. And there's a scene in the Borough of Suburbia where he goes round to see his girlfriend and the dad sets the dog on him. And the dog attacks him, and indeed the dog copulates with him. Attractive dog, actually, I have to say, with really nice legs.
Bit furry.
Yeah. But so it was really rough. and it was really dull.
I mean, you said another emotive word besides rough and dull. You also said wasteland earlier on. I mean, is this your impression of the physicality of the place as well? I mean,
Well, it was bombed out then. Even then, I'm talking about the mid-60s. So, you know, sometime after the war, but it was still really bombed out and sort of broken. And you began to realise, as probably you realised, that actually most of the grown-ups around you had been traumatised by the war. And there were a lot of EastEnders in Bromley who had come, you know, escaped from where they're being bombed and come down our way. So there was a real sense that something really terrible had happened, and it was the end of the empire. Britain had sort of collapsed and was withdrawing and all of that. So I spent years, and indeed I'm still trying to figure out what went on and how you fit into all that. And I guess writing The Buddha of Suburbia, which was the book I've been writing throughout my teenage years, was to try and find out how you could be a hippie and a packy at the same time in South London in the 70s.
Reasonable effort. I mean, it's perhaps annoying for you to have to refer to Buddha, but you have already. But in that, there is a more lyrical side to the suburbs that is developed, isn't there? An idea of a kind of lurking behind the privet, a polymorphous perversity. I mean, was that your experience as a child? Did you see the pampas grass twitch?
Well, the idea of it was that it was very quiet, but then the only contact we had with the outside world as kids really was through music. You know, you'd listen to John Peel, and then there was record shops in Bromley, and then really it was punk, and then punk came to Bromley. And there was a group of kids called the Bromley Contingent, who I was at school with, who later became Susie and the Banshees, and Bill Broad, a little boy who became Billy Idol, went to Bromley Grammar, and he was around. So it was affluent. So there were garages. You could go to people's houses and play, you know, music in their garages and listen to the Velvet Underground.
And what about the physicality of the place? Because Bromley has quite a rural feel. I mean, there's a lot of green space, there's a lot of twittering. Did that affect you at all, or was it just that was not something you were involved in?
Well, you'd walk through the fields.
Yeah.
I mean, London was up there, just train ride away, and then you'd walk through the fields, and there were cows and sheep, and you'd go hang around in haystacks and loaf around. But also in those days, of course, people, they didn't care for their children in the same way. You know, your mum would give you some money in the morning and she didn't expect to see you till 6 o'clock, and she didn't phone you up, they didn't know where you were not tracked by anybody, and you were just completely free. You just fuck off and disappear and have adventures.
I mean, I'm just interested in this kind of monocultural Bromley in the 60s and 70s, because my experience of a suburban childhood in London was that I went to secondary school just after Armin had kicked the Gujarati and Punjabi communities out of Uganda, and my class at school, age 13, was divided very neatly into thirds, and one third we called the Yoks, who were like the indigenous kids, and then there were the Yids, who were a third of the class, and the Pakis, who were the other third, of course were not Pakis at all, but Punjabi and Gujarati kids. So it was a fairly mixed, and we were so evenly weighted that nobody could get the upper hand. I mean, there was no possible room for friction. I mean, and I, like you, am a kind of slightly liminal. My mother was an American Jew who came to London in the late 50s, and my father was a middle-class Englishman. So, and we were surrounded by, I mean, people were talking in this afternoon session about, or I think it's Ken Warple's coinage, about the Essexudos, but I was surrounded by an early kind of Jewish exodus from the East End to kind of Golders Green, Hendon, and my mother, who was grew up in Queens and was, she used to quote Chesterton. Chesterton, a famous anti-Semite, said, the Jews are like everybody else, but more so. And my mother would say, that's the trouble with the English Jews. They're like the English, but more so. And so she had nothing but contempt for the Jewish families around us, she thought were pale and colourless and uninteresting. And so I had a sense of this suburban life as being quite diverse, which seems very different to yours, only, I mean, you know, at the same time. And is that just Bromley, do you think? Was Bromley particularly...
It was then, it was completely white.
Yeah.
And the only Asian faces were really, you know, me and my cousins and my uncles and so on. And that to me was a real contrast for me. It was really lively, there were big meals, everybody sat around, it was warm and loud and, you know. And I was very impressed by that part of my life, and the English bit seemed really staid and slow.
Again, I think, you know, people were talking, somebody was mentioning in an earlier session about this image that London has of itself as having endlessly been an incredibly cosmopolitan city and it's true in a very narrow sense, but it's really not true. I mean, the ethnic minority composition of England, I think these stats are right, in the mid-70s would have only been about 3.5%, 4%. So it was like a white city. It was and when you started going into town, was that what you saw as the way out, the way into something better?
When you went across the river by Battersea Bridge, you would cheer. I mean, your heart would lift, you were out. There were black people, you know, and you go to Notting Hill and so on, you see black and Asian people and there'll be other foods and so on. And you really felt then that you weren't picked on, that you weren't stared at. When you walked around Bromley, and particularly for my father, you know, who was always being chased, you know, people were always giving you the eye. They'd always look at you. You always felt you were in danger, that someone would have a go. They'd say, back off, Backy, you know.
And what did he say about it, your father, about this level of harassment to you?
Well, he'd come to England to live. He'd given up on India and he'd married my mother and made a life here and he wanted to be here. And he thought that you just had to, well, he wanted me to be English. He said, just pass, just pretend to be English. And then he said, you should change your name. He said, you know, why don't you change your name to Paul or Richard or something, and then no one will notice you, as though that would change the colour of your skin. The fact that you were called Richard didn't seem to me to make any difference. But that was his theory, and in those days, people did pass. There's a wonderful film about it I was watching the other day called Sapphire, about a girl who passes. And then when she dies, all the people who knew her and found out that she was black were horrified by the fact she was black. So my dad thought we could just disappear into England, that you would become white, that then you wouldn't be chased. I mean, people literally would, when you came out of Bromley South Station, they would chase you. You know, you were in fear all the time. I mean, it was really, really traumatic. It took me years to kind of work out that there wasn't anything that I could do myself to change myself, to not be a victim, that you in a sense had to change the world.
You went to Lancaster to read philosophy. What was it like when you got there? Did you identify yourself as a South Londoner, or did you start reinventing yourself at that point?
Oh God, yeah, well I went there for a year. Yeah.
But that was the first move away from home, presumably.
Well, that was even worse. I was living in Morecambe. I was living in Morecambe.
What was that like? I mean, well, you came up this afternoon and said, we're like Morecambe and Wise. Maybe there was a telling remark.
Well, yes, those years were very stoned years, Will, actually.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right.
I mean, those were the years when I nearly crashed and I just about saved my arse. And I came back to London and I went to university. And my dad got me into King's. And my dad really shoved me. I was about to give up entirely on education and sort of collapse into total degeneracy. And I went to university in London.
At King's?
Yeah, and got my shit together. And then I was all right after that. And then I started working at the Royal Court. And then I started writing seriously. and I, was hanging around with actors and directors and writers at the Royal Court. And at that moment, my arse, as it were, was saved. But I nearly went down.
And were your parents still in Bromley at that point, during those
My
years?
mum left Bromley 3 months ago. I went to the house. I was in Bromley 3 months ago, and I went to the house, and I walked out, and I thought, this is the last time I'll ever come here, and walked out and said goodbye, and that was that. So, yeah.
And what's it like now, the old house? What's the neighbourhood like now?
Well, all the shops are Indian now. Or, you walk around all the old shops where you worked as a paper boy and you knew this person and that person, and actually it's all Indians and Chinese restaurants now. So it's become, as they say, as multicultural as everywhere
And
else.
there's black and brown faces on the street.
Yeah, and all of
And
all
do you
of
think
that.
it has a different feel? I mean, it feels different, noticeably, as against that homogenous wasteland you remember from childhood.
Well, I can't say really. Well, I can. All I have, you just remember the rain and Sunday afternoons in the rain and the sort of hopelessness and the lack of contact and the desire to get out. Really. So, for me, being in the suburbs was more or less entirely traumatic, really, and horrific. But it's a really good thing for a writer.
Well, there's a sense of that there has to be a possibility because there's no actuality, and I'm glad you raised that. And again, Sunday trading, one sense of the city now, and not to go the sort of Jonathan Creary 24/7 late capitalism and the death of sleep line, but there was a certain repose in suburbia when you weren't being chased in the 70s. It was quiet.
You went there, it was a quiet place. It was a decent place to live. People had a reasonable standard of living. They had nice houses, but they were mostly concerned with their furniture. I mean, what they wanted, I remember people saying, we've gone G-plan, and it was really aspirational in that sense. It was materialistic. What they wanted was better furniture. They didn't want more culture or better words or books or any of that stuff. They wanted a higher standard of living, because most people in most of their houses had furniture from before the war, actually, and most of the houses were still pretty rough. And so the idea that you would get G-plan and you'd spend, we'd spend all weekend with my dad looking at carpets.
I grew up on the fringes of the Hampstead Garden suburb, which of course was a planned suburb, and it was meant to be mixed development. It was meant to represent some sort of ethos, was meant to be encrypted into its actual design, the fabric of the place. Though that was gone by the 60s, it was also somewhere where a lot of Labour politicians lived. So Harold and Mary Wilson had a house in the Hampstead Garden suburb. Of course, Peter Mandelson's parents were there. And there was a sense in that kind of suburbia that suburbia did articulate a kind of quite wide portfolio of social and cultural aspirations, that there was something kind of going on. But that's not what you... I mean,
Did you have that sense of thinking, I've got to fucking get out of here, otherwise I'm done for?
Well, I thought I was dead already from growing up in Australia. I mean, I was waiting to be born, in Australian Aboriginal culture, everything's in an inchoate state until it jumps up into being, and it seemed to me that the suburbs were a kind of dream time. They didn't, it was like history hadn't actually begun yet. And of course, central London was depopulated. You were talking about the impact of the war. Right up until the early 80s, there were still quite a lot of bomb sites in central London. Old Street, for example, was still a bomb site. And we'd do the same thing that you did from Bromley, which was, from quite a young age, come into the centre, and we'd hang out in the museum quarter in South Kensington, or in our teens, just to be in the centre of town. Or go and buy amyl nitrate in Kensington Market, or Bieber, nick stuff from Bieber. That was a big suburban thing. Bieber suffered terribly. There's this big swish kind of hit. It must have opened in 71 or 72 in Kensington, where the Harvey Nicks is now. And it was just full of suburban kids nicking stuff, so a program, black ostrich feathers, I remember, were particularly easy to nick. But even the centre of town of London at that time, as I recall it, compared to the city today, was relatively unfrenetic. But you also mentioned, we were chatting before about how important music had been in suburbia and how important punk was. And in a sense, London's, you know, you were talking about Vivienne Westwood and the King's Road, and people associate punk with Chelsea, but it's an erroneous association. I mean, most of the bands, I was at school with the Vibrators, for example. You had Billy Idol and the Banshees. I mean, that's where the music was coming from, wasn't it?
Yeah, because you would be able to buy Velvet Underground records and so on, and then you could paint your bedroom, and you could make a group. And at Bromley Tech, at the college I went to, there were a lot of bands, and you'd see almost, you know, the Pink Fairies and all those kind of semi kind of punk, early punk bands like the MC5, influenced by the MC5 and so on, would come down, thrash around in Bromley. It wasn't very far for people to come down. I remember being very, very impressed one day when Roger McGough came down with Brown Pattern and gave a reading, and then they went back to London in their van, and I thought, that's glamour. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to do. I want to go down and give a reading and, you know, fly back with some birds in fur coats in the back of the van, and that was so significant for me.
But you stayed in London, and how has your sense of the city changed in your adult life? I mean, do you identify as a Londoner? Is it important to you?
It's funny actually, because I live in Shepherd's Bush, and I realised the other day that I'm now once again, really living in a suburb. London has moved further and further. In my day, it was the King's Road. Obviously, now the King's Road is nothing, and I believe the action is in Dalston and Hackney and Vauxhall and so on. So it's moved away from me. So I'm once more, as it were, kind of living in a suburb.
But I mean, Shepherd's Bush is very much, because I used to live there some years ago, is very much feels itself to be, you know, cresting the wave of increased property prices as they push out, you know, all the kind of middle class families I knew in the bush are now in Acton, and there's this sense of the kind of rising tide of property in that way. But is your manor important to you? Because you've been in the bush for a long time now.
Yeah, well, I've been in West London since the mid-70s.
Right, well, it's a hell of a long time.
Yeah, well, it was.
Why?
Because it was just because of the children.
Yeah, it was just circumstantial.
It's really because of the kids. My kids could go to school, and there was transport around there, and you could move around, and why not be there rather than anywhere else? And also, the bush was rough until the last 5 years, really, and we got a Sainsbury's recently. We got 2 Sainsbury's and a Tesco's now. And we used to say, you'll never gentrify the bush, but and so that means that all the Indian shops on the strip on the Shepherd's Bush Road, you know, which were repellent, but they were run by decent blokes, have now been replaced by Sainsbury's. So you can see that it's the end. And many of the people who live in my street are French bankers now, and they commute to Paris.
Well, I'm south of you, and in Clapham we have more French bankers than you do. The area around Northcote Road is called Nappy Valley, and has the highest birth rate in Europe, and more branches of Petit Bateau than you can shake a little or a big willy at. Thank you, Hanif. I'd like to kind of throw it open and just maybe use the end of this session to have anybody who wants to kind of offer their sense of London, outer London, the totality of London, their identity or not as a Londoner and what it sort of entails, or if you've got any questions for Hanif specifically on what he said.
Or will, indeed.
Well,
Hanif, you didn't really answer the question about, are you still in touch with, I guess, your old school chums from Bromley? And I was just wondering, I think sometimes with the suburbs, you know, there are people who want to flee, but also people who are very comfortable. Have they stayed in Bromley?
Yeah,
and do they invite you down for readings? And do you go down with women with fur coats in cars?
Well, I so much wanted to get away from all of that that I left it behind, and those friendships behind as well, because I couldn't have with the people I was at school with the conversations that I wanted to have, you know. I was a kid, I was reading Baudelaire and Rimbaud and Dostoevsky and all that stuff that you get in the library in the days when they had libraries. And they had really good libraries in Bromley, actually. So every day after school, I'd go to one of 3 or 4 local libraries, and I'd just sit there and I'd read, you know, you could sit down and just read Crime and Punishment. It seems incredible that you could do that for free. So I wanted to get away from all that I thought, where are the most interesting people? Where are they? Where are those people? And I'm going to get on a train and go and sit with them and join them. And I went to the Royal Court when I was 18, and the first afternoon I was at the Royal Court, I met Samuel Beckett, who was rehearsing a play called Footfalls with Billy Whitelaw. And I would sit at the back, and I thought, this morning I was in Bromley, and this afternoon I'm sitting here with Samuel Beckett. I thought, this is the life for me. I know which I prefer. And so just finding interesting people who would extend you, who would say things to you that you'd never heard before, that was what I was drawn to.
Yeah, I was wondering, both of you had this incredible urge to leave the suburb because it was killing you, and then the pinnacle of your ambition would be to go to the center of London. I mean, for me, coming from Holland, the pinnacle of my ambition would not be to go to the center of Amsterdam.
No, it's very dull.
Yeah,
that's
it's
why.
very dull. But, you know, what about going away? Because it seems that this idea of leaving is centered on the center of London. What about leaving in the sense of, I want to go to Paris, New York?
No, none of that.
No. But that's what always has struck me as so strange in London. There's a fantastic and the most beautiful culture of complaint about the city that you can find anywhere. I don't think there are any cities that are better at complaining about themselves than London. Yet, it does not lead to an exodus. If it's, I mean, as a very, very simplistic, nearly Calvinist Dutch reaction would be, if you don't like it, why not?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're driving at. My own case is somewhat idiosyncratic. I did assume I would leave London. It's idiosyncratic at 2 levels. One was my father was chairman of a pressure group called the Town and Country Planning Association, and he was somebody who was vitally interested in London's development. And a lot of my childhood consisted of walking around the fringes of London, being lectured on urbanism.
It's odd though, Will, because when you think of our contemporaries, think of Martin Amis or older writers like Rushdie or younger like Zadie Smith, Harry Kunzru, they've all gone to New York. You and I are the only ones left staggering around in London, actually. Why are we not in New York?
Well, they're so shallow. I mean, anyway, when I went to I never went to New York when my mother was alive because it was her city and she went there a lot. And I started going there in the 90s, but not to really stay. And a few years ago, I've had this long project of walking out of London. So that's my way of leaving the city. I like to walk out of it. And the first time I walked out of the city about 15 years ago, I didn't actually know anybody, including Ian Sinclair, I may add, who I knew, who had walked from central London to actual open farmland in a single day. And I didn't even know whether it was possible, physically or psychically, or whether you would get to some sort of liminal zone where you'd be flung back by a kind of force field. And it does take I've now done it quite a number of times. You have to leave, 7 on a summer's morning and you will be in open fields as the sun is setting. But I also had intended to leave London properly as a young man, as in the fullness of time, but all my family left instead. And by the age of 25, my family were all either dead or had emigrated. And I found myself in vacant possession, as I saw it, of the entire city. So I never left. I thought, sod it, I'm just going to stay. And I don't know about you, Hanif, whether you feel it so powerfully, but I think prose fiction is one of the greatest art forms for conveying place that there is. And what tells you that it does it so well is that you, as readers, you all have had the experience of reading a text describing a place that you have never been to, and you know how well the writer knows it or not, intuitively. And you'll often read a text and think, they're blagging this, they don't really know this place. And I think as a writer, if you're concerned with place at all, if you stay too long in one place, it becomes your muse, which is what happened to me with London. And I've set all my stuff here. I've set the vast majority of it on the fringes of the Doughnut, where I grew up. Most of my fiction is set in the kind of outer London suburbs.
I never thought that if I went to New York, I would become a better writer. I'd probably have a higher standard of living, and the parties would be better.
No,
but I never thought I'd become a better writer, right? Because I always thought of myself as an English writer, actually, and an English realist writer. I want to write about what I see when I walk down my street, what the people are wearing, who are those, why are those Somalians sitting in the park, why are they there, why have they come, you know, what's their journey. So I thought, when I was in Los Angeles, I thought, well, I can't write about this, I don't know anything, I can't work out why these people are here, but I can work that out in Bromley and in Shepherd's Bush.
Yes, and in the work, Hanif, there is quite a fine-grained sense, though it's not your main preoccupation, of, you know, the spatialisation of social class. It's there in My Beautiful Laundrette. It's there in a film of yours I particularly like called The Mother, where you wouldn't have thought it's the main theme of the picture at all, but it's actually there. In some ways, it's about gentrification as much as anything else, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
It's there, isn't it, that realist tradition in everything you do. You want it to be, you know, as Stendhal said, you think your art should be a mirror of life as you see it around you.
Yeah.
So you're slightly stuffed, aren't you? You can't move now.
Well, you wouldn't recognise, I couldn't see that, I wouldn't understand that anywhere else. If I had said a novel in Paris or in New York or whatever, but you could see that in London, the way people dress, the way they speak, every nuance, as you say, gradation of them tells you who they are and where they're from.
There's a woman at the back with glasses behind you, or there's a guy here also with glasses. I don't know whether that's some sort of pattern.
I was going to ask, you were saying how the suburbs are quite safe and beautiful and a nice place to live, but I was just wondering whether that's its sort of downfall, and for young people, in that it's almost like you're at the finish instead of at the start. And with the centre of a city, it's all about, well, I found that when I went to another city to university and kind of started at the bottom in squalid, like, student housing, I felt like something had begun. While living in the suburbs, I felt like everything was already finished, everything was solved, and maybe that's what is the problem for young, maybe creative people, that if you live in a place where everyone's quite happy and everything's solved, that it's not a very creative place to be.
No, I mean, and I think that, you know, it was something that Ken Warple again raised this afternoon in an earlier session, was the extent to which our conception of the suburban is still built around a very, very firm and rigid sense of the nuclear family. You know, you could argue that almost all suburban development is heavily gendered in a way. These were enclaves in which the men all left in the morning and were not back again till the evening. So our whole notion of suburban existence is in some way, you know, you think of it as an end state. Well, of course, if you view it as a young woman and you're viewing it through the lens of a kind of, it's the spatialisation of patriarchy, the suburb, because it's what it's saying to you is, this is it. You're to go into that little house, young woman, and stay there till they carry you out in a box. So yeah, you would view it in quite a terminal way. And I wonder, and again in some of this afternoon sessions, people have been talking about, you know, what's the city of the future going to look like in demographic terms? Because it's quite clearly not going to be built on this patriarchal paradigm. It may be built on a different one. So I think that's right. And then there's this man here with his hand up, wearing a patterned shirt. Could I describe him more until the microphone gets to him?
Yep, so I grew up in Northcote Road, described earlier as
Nappy Valley.
I was born into Nappy Valley in the 80s.
But you're not a French banker.
I'm not a French banker, so back then it was quite a normal place. It was reasonably multicultural. It had a street market. And today, lots of stalls. I remember there was a stall that sold eggs, just eggs, and another one that sold just watercress. Now there's a stall that sells olives, I think just olives, another one that sells bread and baby grows, etc.
It's a great success story.
It's a great success story, okay, but it's changed a great deal. I think, like you say, most of the people that live there probably are, a lot of them are from France. I think possibly people that are willing to put up with worse food and worse weather just to pay less taxes to a socialist government, allegedly.
Refugees from Paris. Well, refugees welcome from Paris, like we say in Shepherd's Bush.
But what's interesting about this particular part of London, it's SW116, the suffix, and it has the largest amount of property debt in the entire country. So that area, the Nappy Valley, owes 960 million in property debt. So it's close to £1 billion in mortgages in this valley. And if you go there today, it comes across as quite a pleasant place. It's like walking along King's Road, but everyone's miserable, and it's really unfriendly, and it's not a nice place at all. Although it looks nice, and every house is beautifully turned out. And I moved to Tooting, which is still within Wandsworth, and it's a really cheerful place. It's great. I really like it. And but it's on the fringe of the Doughnut. So
yes, you are now.
So from there, I walk down to places like Collier's Wood and Mitcham, which are weird and quite scary and bizarre places, and it's very inspiring.
Excuse me, you'll have to embroider that. Collier's Wood is weird.
Weird.
Could you please fill this picture in for us?
So in Collier's Wood now is an out-of-town retail park with an enormous twin temple to Sainsbury's and M&S, but it was formerly the grounds of Merton Priory, a very ancient and important religious centre, demolished by Henry VIII, turned over to industry, and then eventually repurposed to consumerism. There's rivers that run through there, like the Wandle.
Yeah, the last time I was down that way, I was walking the Wandle, as you do.
And it's fascinating. And it leads from there down to Mordenhall Park, a National Trust property, with these extraordinary sort of marshland flood area with rivers running through it and old water wheels and industrial remnants there. And then from there you can go on to Mitcham, where they have the oldest cricket ground, which is still in use, with the club just across from a dual carriageway, and people on the balcony watching the cricket. And then from there you can go to the town centre, where there's 2 pubs, and one of them has a sign that says, "Please can our patrons stop taking drugs in the toilet, otherwise we'll be shut down by the police."
Plus ça change.
Yeah. But it's a very weird, bizarre space. I don't think people have realised somewhere like Mitcham has any kind of regeneration potential, but sadly it does.
What I'm hearing from you is an enthusiastic new Doughnutian identity. But it seems very much to be made up. I mean, you've obviously got a sort of flaneur's sensibility that you're now applying to outer London.
Well, I think the one thing I'd say is that sadly it seems still to be quite a lonely, empty place. I think it would be great if there were more flanners out there, because it's certainly somewhere I can go and think, but I still go into central London to see my friends. And luckily enough, they live there, some of them. So
you got a question?
But it's very exciting.
What you're describing, I think, is the chocolate chips inside the donut. And, the donut that we're talking about is just this doughy amalgam of nothing that just surrounds jam in the middle. It's not a hole in the middle. I mean, it's a jam-filled donut. It's 3-dimensional. It's not 2-dimensional. And inside, and inside that dough, there are chunks of chocolate, and there are those lovely parks, and there's, you know, Addington Palace down in Croydon, and there's just some fantastic places around in that suburban dough. But we just, you know, we talk them down and we ignore them, and the story needs to change. And you started to change the story in the Standard the other day, and that's what got me here, because this was supposed to be a celebration of Outer London. And
Yeah,
yet,
but
as our friend over there says, we've spent, you know, we spend the whole time just denigrating the places that we live, and we've got to start changing the story and talking it up.
Yeah, but I couldn't agree, and I like very much what you said about.
I don't want to talk. I haven't come here to talk up Bromley.
Have you?
Of all the things I wanted to do with my life, that was never. I've never thought for a moment that would be one of them. I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
We'll all be surprised to open our paper on Monday and find that Hanif has been chosen as the UNESCO ambassador for Bromley. Anybody else? There's you, sir.
Thanks very much. I'm also wearing glasses, so it is a pattern.
Yeah, I know. It is a pattern.
I've recently started walking home from work in the evenings, and it's a beautiful walk from Liverpool Street to Greenwich, and I've really enjoyed it. I get to see so much of London walking through that way, but I'm new to London, so I'm just wondering if there's any walking routes you might recommend. I know, I'm a real outsider for the Doughnut. So.
Well, you want to go out on the old Broad Street line, don't you? Out to, and then take the ferry over, if it's still running. It's still, I think it's called the Nye Bevan, the ferry, the Woolwich Ferry, if you take the Woolwich Ferry. And that's actually quite a bucolic walk out from Liverpool Street. Because you're in the footsteps of Pepys, who famously walked back and forth down when he was inspecting the naval yards down here, would walk in and out from the city. So you're in good footsteps, but it's interesting because you were talking about walking around Tooting as well, and I have to say, for me, the way I connect with the reality of the Doughnut and celebrate it is through walking, but it's not to everybody's taste, is it? And I wonder whether part of the problem that the Doughnut faces is very much related to the car culture. Which is what, of course, Bojo was harping on when he got the Doughnut vote out, was appealing to the car culture, and there does seem a bit of a problem. So anybody else from kind of who lives in the Doughnut want to comment on Doughnut identity and celebrating it to somewhat counter the negativity about Bromley?
I was just going to say kind of a reaction beforehand about kind of a creative young class maybe being drawn to the centre. And now I think the creative classes maybe has an aversion to the centre, which has become quite uninspiring, filled with chains, and you know what you're getting everywhere. And I was just wondering now if maybe where beforehand you had lots of these small towns and villages that are now encompassed and engulfed under the broad term of London, if we're going to maybe start to see things breaking away again, especially with technology and the ability to be omnipresent, the way that people are changing the way they work, working for themselves much more. And maybe we're going to be able to have these cultures and have these more, or create more identity for the areas that are outside of London and be less London central-centric. You know, we can start to see more diversity and flourishing, interesting things happening outside.
Well, I certainly think that's been part of thinking in London development circles for a long, long time, that idea that, you know, of separate identities on the periphery. But I wonder, I mean, isn't that identity London so overpowering that the places like Uxbridge, for example, or Staines, or even Croydon fights this? Well, Croydon is the prime example, where, you know, of a completely schizophrenic area. Is it Croydon? Is it London? Is Croydon really a place? I mean, so when the session of Ken Warple this afternoon and Patrick Wright, and so I thought that what they were driving at, there's something very interesting goes on in the relationship between Essex and the East End, and Essex is kind of vitally under-imagined in the London topos, which centres very much to the west, because that's where the money is. And Essex has been able to kind of flourish as this much stranger and more idiosyncratic place through being under-imagined, But I suppose what I always fondly thought about the Doughnut in general was that its very under-imagined character is what makes it so potentially exciting and interesting in terms of change. You know, so maybe the kind of change you're talking about is what's going to happen. Maybe you're part of a young class of doughnut makers who are going to make it more exciting. Let's hope. I mean, at any rate, to counteract Hanif's miserable childhood. I mean, you know, makes one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich sound like a trip to the fucking seaside.
We should do it. We should walk there. We should go down to Bromley, and then you'll.
Well, keep us fit, get chased, won't it? And on that note, thank you all very much, and thanks especially, Hanif. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Thank you. Thank you.